Today, a whole new world will open up to you because you will be learning the basics of JavaScript. From this point on, the opportunity to create projects from basic games or complex web apps will be there. I hope you're ready. Let's get started. So let's go over what JavaScript actually is. JavaScript is basically a client-side scripting language. That means that it runs on the client's computer. It does not need necessarily a server, and this way you can view a website and make it interactive. As JavaScript makes websites interactive, it can also be used for event handling, for example, click events, like clicking on a div, which is not accessible necessarily with CSS and HTML only, or adding and removing elements dynamically, which also isn't available with CSS or HTML only. There are certain frameworks that use JavaScript and that make development easier. For example, React, Angular, or Vue, which you might have heard about. Maybe you have heard about Svelte as well. These frameworks use JavaScript in its core and put it into a new environment so the developers can make their life easier. You can build web apps, desktop apps, and mobile apps. For example, mobile apps are done with React Native. And let's just get this clear, JavaScript is not Java. Java is a completely different language. It's used for different things, and JavaScript is used for making websites interactive. And here's what we'll be covering throughout this crash course. So we'll be going over variables, data types, objects, arrays, all that stuff, to loops, conditionals, functions, and in the end, DOM selection, manipulation, and the event handling. Let's jump to our code. So here we are, I have some code prepared, where basically there are some h1, h2, and 3 div elements. And we have a style.css link as well, where there is only one class, but we'll be going over these elements and classes while doing the JavaScript section, which is completely empty. To start this off, you won't be having your JavaScript linked, and we'll be starting with linking that. So to link it, you'll be coming down to the body tag, and before it ends, you need to say script, and then it will have an attribute source. You press Ctrl plus space, and then choose the script.js that you've created or whatever you've named it. And the reason we need to put it before the body tag ends is because the compilation of the code goes line by line. So it first processes the head, then the body, and it renders out the elements, and then processes the script. But what if the script was processed before the elements were rendered, and we would be accessing some elements from the script? Well, then the script wouldn't know what to do. If they would get errors because the elements wouldn't be created yet, and we are trying to access them. That's why it's important to put the script before the end of your body tag. Then move on to our script, and what I'd like you to do is press F12 in your browser, and then developer tools will pop up. To change this up for the video, I'll come here, open the 3 dots, and I can change the docking options here. So I say dock to bottom. If you want to see the whole website, you could also undock it into a separate window. My index.html is opened with live servers, so these values are probably given because of that. Don't worry if you see any of these. You come to the console, or sorry, this little arrow here, and choose the console, which I am on right now, because that's what we'll be working in mainly. Because console.log will be your first debugging function. So let's just try it out. So say console.log and, for example, hello world. You will be able to see that the hello world appeared right there. So this is one basic way to write to the console, and there are 2 others I'd like to show you, which is console.warn, which will throw out this yellow message, which is basically you're already seeing it here because of the third-party cookies and whatnot. This is a warning. Then you can see that there is this is a warning right there. And the third one is the console.error, which will be a red error. This is usually what you get if something isn't compiling properly, but developers can use it for custom error messages. So this is an error. You can see that the error appeared right there on the left window. And now that we've gone over the basic console logging values, I'd like to turn off here the warnings and all this stuff because it's bothering me. So come here to default levels. This is probably set to default levels, and then turn off warnings and also turn off errors so that you can only see the infos, which is basically the hello world because it's not console.warn or not console.error. Another way you could potentially warn a user about something is by saying alert, and then here between the quotes symbolize strings, which we'll be talking about in a minute. You simply write something. For example, this is my alert, and then it appears right there. I will comment this out because it would be bothering us throughout the recording. And now let's jump to variables. So what are variables? Variables basically containers that contain data. And there are three ways you can create variables. One would be with the var keyword, then giving it a name, and then an equal, and then giving it a value, for example 10. Now, please don't use var ever if it's possible. It's a deprecated way to create variables because it can be globally accessed. So if you have, for example, a conditional, which we'll be going over later, and you create another variable with the name var, then it will change the original value as well, which can cause quite a mess if you're working with those. So I just say deprecated there, don't use it. The other two ways you can create variables is by saying let, and then the name of the variable, and then give it a value. I'll give it a true value this time. And basically, b can now be true. And the third variation would be saying const c equals Adam. The difference between the let var and the const is that the const cannot be changed. It can only be given a value when you create it, but not after. The let and var can be changed, but again, the var is deprecated, don't use it. So if you know that you'll be changing a value while creating a variable, just simply use let. Otherwise, always use const. And let me show you. For example, if I wanted to say c equals John, then if I turn back the warnings, sorry, not the warnings, the errors, it would say that type error assignment to a constant variable. So this will throw us errors. And also if I was to say const throw me errors and do it like this, it will throw us simply errors because it's missing an initializer. So because it cannot be changed later, it has to be given a value at the start. And since it's not given one, it's throwing us errors. So these are two ways that you have to avoid. I go and check off the errors. So basically, variables are just data containers, and it will make more and more sense as we go on. And now we'll go over data types. I'll be creating a few variables. There are overall 5 data types, basic data types in JavaScript. One of them is a string. A string is basically a row of characters. The string is always identified by the double quotation marks, and it's just basically usually a word or a sentence or something. Then there is the bool, which can have either a true or a false value. It's either 0 or 1 in the computer system, so it can either have true or false. That's all a bool is. Then there are numbers, which my number, for example, 10. A number can basically be just a number. It can also be a decimal number if you wanted to, with the point given there. Then the third data type that I'd like to go through is the null value, which is basically a value that you give intentionally because you want to signal that this value has not been set. For example, when signing up for something, you might want to set a field to null, for example, the email field, to know that the user haven't typed in anything to that field yet. And if he's trying to submit it that way, you can identify that it hasn't been written into and the app is not bugged. It's just the user that didn't insert anything there. And there is also the undefined value. So let my undefined, which will be, you can also set it to undefined. This is the basic type that is given when errors are thrown. So when, for example, you try to access a variable that hasn't been given a value, for example, that value, then you will get undefined. And we can simply look at it by not giving anything. The next thing that I'm gonna do is console log out a little bit of these values and then console log out their types. So to console log out a variable, you can say console.log and not give the quotation marks here, but simply say, for example, my string, and then it will print out my string. You could also console log them out with concatenation, so console.log, this is, and then the way you did it in the old age was saying plus, then inserting the variable here, which is my string, then plus, and then again the quotation marks to write something, and then and this is my number, and then plus, and then my number. So it's a long way to do it, and it can be quite frustrating if you're trying to write something complex, but there it is. It basically inserted the variables. Now the more comfortable way to do this is by saying console.log and instead of quotation marks using backticks, which depending on where you are on your keyboard may be different, just search it out. And then in the backticks you can simply write, so this is, and then you can say $, then curly braces, and now it's usable as an insertable space, a placeholder for your variables, so my string can come in there. This is my string, and then you can simply continue, and this is my number, and then again $, brackets, and my number. It typed out the same thing, but it's a way more comfortable solution. Now let's go over console logging out the data types, and you can do that with the type of keyword, so type of my string, which will simply say string. And while console logging, you can also put a comma in here and console log out multiple values, for example, not just type of my string and then a new console log, but you insert one value and then comma, insert another value, and I will also console log out the value of each type. So the my string is a string. All right, let's copy this over, then my bool, and then my bool here as well. So a boolean value and its actual value is set to true. Now do it again with the number, it's a number and its value is 10. Do it with the null and you'll see something interesting. The value of it is a null and it's set to be an object. Objects are something more complex that we'll go over about in the half of the video, probably. So it's actually something that was messed up in the creation of JavaScript, and it's written on the net if you search it, that it's stayed there since then. So just don't worry about this. This actually should be a null and not an object. You'll find some little type thingies in JavaScript because JavaScript is not a strictly typed language. That means that you don't have to say what type of variable you're creating. But just don't worry about it, you'll get used to this type of freedom. I also come from a C environment. If you've ever programmed in C, you know that you all have to define the types everywhere. And then simply console log out the my undefined, which simply is an undefined type, and this value is also undefined. And see here that I didn't give it any values, which means that by default, JavaScript assigns undefined values to variables. Now I'll comment these out just to clear the console. And let's start working on some string functions. So for example, let my full name will be equal to Wolfgang code. So we've created a string now, and our console log my full name dot length gives you the character length of a string. It can be useful if you're for some reason looping through strings or doing some other stuff. Maybe you just want a little game, a very simple game or whatever. But the length is one property that's usually there for almost all variables. And then you could also console log out the my full name dot to lowercase. This is a method, so you have to put parentheses after it. You have to call it, but it will put it to lowercase. And the reason it's putting it to lowercase is because putting us back, it's throwing us back a completely new string, and we're console logging that out. I could also say let lower part equal, and this one and then simply print out the lower car. And that would still give us the lowercase version, because that's what it's doing when we are console logging it out. We are console logging out the value that it's throwing back at us. I will leave it like this though. And I copy this. There is also one who would have thought if there is lowercase, then there is an uppercase to uppercase. There is also something called console.log my full name dot substring, which will cut out a piece of your string and throw it back. For example, since everything in programming is indexed from 0, so it's not starting from the 1, so the W in the Wolfden code will be the 0. I want the start to be 0 and the end to be, for example, 4. That would mean the 5th character is what the 4 refers to. Then you can see that the 4 characters were given back because it says the 0 index, so it says the substring that the substring includes the characters up to, but not including the characters indicated by the end. So that means the 5th character won't be included, but up to the 3 or the 4 characters which says wolf will be. So you can play around with strings. There are some other functions as well. Strings have many functions, but these are some main ones I wanted to have a look at. And there is also one more. I create a split example because there is a function called split, and split is very useful throughout programming. So there is, for example, a string that has the name of companies like Apple, Microsoft, AMD, and NVIDIA, and they are all separated by commas. Then you can come here and console log them out, but not this string, but the split example dot split, and then you give what character you would like to split by, which is basically the comma. And if I save this now, it will console log out well, basically a box, an array, but we haven't gone through arrays yet. We will be in a minute, which is basically contains from 0 index to 3 the little values that were split up. I'll comment these out, and now let's go over arrays. So there are 2 ways I can show you to create arrays. One of them is the unpopular. This is the unpopular way, saying equal new array and then parentheses, and then you give how many elements you'd like in that array. For example, 3. The popular way is by saying you create a new variable and then simply put brackets in here, which will signal that this is an array. And unlike in other programming languages, arrays can have a growing number of elements, so an infinite number of elements, and there can be any type in them. So for example, there are multi-type arrays. That, for example, this in any C language is very strict how you assign arrays, because there are string arrays, int arrays, but here you can simply put in here a string, you can throw in there a number, you can throw in there a boolean value, and in fact even arrays in arrays. So this is an array which contains a string basically, so you can even do that. And if I console log it out now, arrays are basically just boxes. They usually contain some values. Most of the times you will be using simple arrays, simple type, not multi-type arrays, but it's important to know that there is nothing wrong with multi-type arrays. And you can see there is an array inside our array. And to access the elements of an array, you can say multi-type, for example, because this is what we are working with right now, and then brackets, and then the 0 index. So the 0 index will say access the first element in the array, and you can do the same multi-type, the second element, multi-type, third element, and then since there are 4 elements in it, now if I console log it out, string 5 and true, but I could also do what I said, length is accessible in many ways. So multi-type, we are accessing the multi-types. Let me just break this up. We are accessing the multi-types, multi-type.length, which would be actually 4, but we only have 4 elements in it, and if I say 4 in here, that would access a 5th element, which would throw us errors, if you understand what I'm talking about. So we instead say multitype.length -1, which will say 3, just like 0, 1, 3, which will access the 4th element for us. And there we go, it even logged out the other array that was in the array. And now, since arrays contain multiple values, I will simply put a console log in here. There are some juicy array methods, some basic ones, and then we'll go over some more complex ones that you can use. Here is a test array. It contains numbers from 0, 1, 2, 3. Maybe this is a bit too long. So this will be our separator. I will log out the value, which is console log before the methods. It's 0, 1, 2, 3. Then again, a separator I will copy over here. And to add elements, there are two ways you can do it. Test array dot push and then 4 here, for example. That will mean that we give a number in it, so the value, this could also be true, console log it out. After the push the test array, you can see true got there, but I want to give 4 because, well, we're working with numbers now. So it gives a value to it. But if you read it, appends a new element to the end of the array and returns the new length of the array. So I can actually store this in a variable, console log that out as well, just like this. Push returns the new length of the array, which is now 5. The other way to do it is by saying, but this will append to the start of the array, is by saying test array dot unshift, and then you give a value there, which I'll basically say -1, and then simply console log it out. After the unshift is -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The value that's being pushed is now added completely to the array, so until we remove it, it will stick there. And this one says inserts a new element at the start of an array and returns the new length of the array. So I can basically say const unshift length and then simply console log that out as well, just like this. So unshift returns the new length of the array and then the unshift length is logged out. And basically we've covered the addition methods. Now we'll go to removing the methods, or the removal methods, where we actually remove the two values that we gave. And I've put some empty console logs in here to push up the text so that you can see it better if you're maybe watching from a phone. So for removing elements, there is something called pop. So test array.pop will pop out the last element of the array, just as it says, removes the last element from an array and returns it. If the array is empty, undefined is returned and the array is not modified. That means that whatever we pop out of it, which will be 4 in this example, will also get returned. So const popped item will get returned. I always mistype const, and I will console log it out, both of them. There you can see that after the pop, the 4 is basically gone from our console, and the pop also returns the popped element, which is 4. And then there is the opposite of unshift, which is basically the shift. So it will also return the value shifted item will be equal to the test array dot shift, which basically says removes the first element from an array and returns it. If the array is empty, undefined is returned and the array is not modified. It's the same, except it gives out the -1 value because it's the first value that's being shifted out of the array. And then if I console log this out, also put a separator in here. It's a bit of a mess, we'll comment it out and then we won't have to bother with it, but I wanted to show all of this. So after the shift, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, basically the basic array that we started with, and it also returned the -1 element. So you can see the whole console log message before the methods. It's 0, 1, 2, 3. After the push, we push the 4 in there, and then the push returns the new length of the array, which is 5. Then after the unshift, there is a -1 there, the length became 6. After we popped it, the popped element was 4 and the 4 is gone from the array. Then after we shifted it, then the shifted element, which is -1, got shifted out of the array, and now we're back at our starting point, which is basically 0, 1, 2, and 3. These are the basic addition and removal array functions that you have to know about in JavaScript. And now we'll go on to some different type of array methods. I will create a new array called animals. This new array called animals contains some strings, which basically just bear, wolf, owl, tiger, whatever. We'll go over by console logging out, console.log. There is something called an array, so animals.index of, and then you give it a value. For example, I'd like to get the index of the owl element, which basically is if the bear is 0, the wolf is 1, then the owl is 2. And just like that, it's returned as 2. So you can get, if you know what's inside the array, you can get the index of that element from the array. As for more advanced stuff, there is something called animals.find, for example, and it will receive in an arrow function, which we haven't talked about yet. It will be towards the end of the video. But this basically says that it goes over all the animals, or basically all the elements in the array, and the indexer will be the current animal. So whenever each animal that it's going over is currently the current animal. For example, it will go over the bear, then the current animal will be the bear. Then it will go over the wolf, it will be the wolf then the owl, and it will be equal to the owl. And then it will return us, and here give a condition. So the current animal, this is a condition what we're looking for. The current animal will be equal to the wolf. And this is just a very bare bones, maybe even unused style of the find method. So const found item, and then I console log out the found item. It basically says wolf because there is something called wolf, and it found the wolf and it returned it. And if I copy this all over, it will be found item 2, and maybe not the, we are not looking for the wolf, but we are looking for any elements, so any animals that end with the n, and then it will give us back the lion, because the lion is the only one that ends with an n. So don't get overwhelmed by this. This is just some more advanced and more interesting stuff that I wanted to show you, that you will be able to use these methods. Now I'll comment these out except the animals array, and we'll move on to talking about objects. So what are objects? Objects are basically key and value pairs. To create an object, you simply say const, or let whatever you want, my first object, so basically a variable, and then inside brackets you give the key, and then you give a value to it. A value can be anything. So for example, I can say ID, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or I could also create a cart in here, or for example, Shopify site or whatever it is. So cart and ball, can, bet, these are all key and value pairs. So if I console log out the first objects, console.log my first object, then you can see that those work simply like arrays almost. You can open it up, basically there is an array there, and the way you access the values is very simple. For example, console.log my first object dot, and you can access the cart, you can access the key, then again my first object dot ID. If I save it, there is the value and the 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically just dot, and then access the properties that were given there as key value pairs. You can also create an object array, so an array, and inside it create an object with the, for example, it will be a person with the name Adam, and he will have an age 18. I'll copy this over, put a comma in here, and then again, just except here it will be named John and age 24. And I can console.log object array 0 index element, and this will simply give me back the whole object with the name Adam and the age 18. I could also do this with the first element, or so the second element, or I could also just do it with the second element dot name, so I can access its properties from here as well, and it will give us back John. Basically, these are objects. You can create custom elements with, well, custom properties to your liking. There is something called JSON in JavaScript, and it's a way of storing values, and the way you do it is by, for example, a console logout, the JSON.stringify my first object. And the reason I'm console logging it out is because the stringify will throw back a JSON version of my object, which, as you can basically see, is it's in quotation mark. Everything is in quotation mark, but it's actually the same as the object. So there is the key, the value, the ID, the card, all in quotation marks except for the number. And if I wanted to make this back, so to revert this, I could say, for example, if I have a JSON from somewhere from the server, JSON.parse will parse back a stringified JSON to a normal object. So JSON.parse, and this is something called functional programming when you embed functions into functions and whatnot. JSON.stringify my first object. So this is a mess if you look at it, but don't worry, all we are doing here is parsing back the JSON that we got from the stringify function where we inserted the my first object. This is a more advanced way of doing it, but I wanted to show you because you have to be prepared for anything in the world of JavaScript and crazy developers. And there you can see it parsed back into an object. I simply comment these out and we'll move on to loops. If you've ever encountered loops, loops are basically for going through each element of something in an easy way. The very first signature in every programming language is the for loop, which is basically you give it an index value. You usually start it out at 0. So this is something that will lead the array. You then put semicolons in here. Then you put a condition. If it's, for example, less than 10, so it will run until it's less than 10. Then I++, which will increase the number by 1, the I number by 1. And I will just simply console.log out the I. As you can see, it logged out numbers from 1 to, from 0 to 9. If I wanted to include the 10 as well, I could simply put an equal sign here, which will say less than or equal to 10. And since it's, for example, 10, it's equal to, but the next time it gets incremented, it won't run, because when it gets to this part, it will say, wow, I is greater than 10, so I don't have to execute the I++ or neither what's inside the body of the loop. And as I said, loops are for going over repetitively, for example, array values. So I could say for I equals 0, because we start off at 0 when going through arrays. I less than the animals.length. And here, since we're using the less than, I don't need to put animals.length -1, because then I wouldn't go over all the values. Because by saying animals.length, which I believe is 5 animals are in there, and we're starting from 0, we can easily go with the 4th index being the last one. So basically I just go through all the animals and I++ to increment it, and I will console.log. I will console log out the animals I value. So here, since it's going from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 0 to 5, then it's going to index through all the elements in the array, and then basically just console log them out. Another more comfortable and more readable way to do it is by saying for animal, or you could give any name of this, of animals, which is basically the name of the array, and then simply console.log out the animal. And there you can see it's logged out, but to separate it, I will put an 2 in there. So it's from here on, the bear to wolf to all to, it basically did the same as this one above. And I will comment this out to clear the console. And there is another type of loop that I want to show you is let index equals 0. So the index is, when using this type of loop, is defined outside of the loop. And this loop is called the while loop, which in the parentheses here, you give a condition. So while the index is less than 10, then console.log the index. And if I was to do it my browser will freeze, so I will just, maybe it won't. It's infinitely running. I will just say index plus plus here and save before it completely destroys the browser. Well, it's dead. Great. As you can see, my browser simply crashed because I didn't put the index plus plus in there. That's because it was always 0, it didn't get incremented, so the condition was always true, and it was infinitely logging out every frame, every time all the CPU usage went into logging out that damn index, and that's why it froze. But I wanted to show you that if you don't pay attention while using a while loop, this can happen. So these were the basic loop variants that I could give you, and now we'll have a look at some more special loop variants, with the first one being the for each loop. So I would say animals.forEach. This is a function, so you put parentheses after it. It receives a syntax like this, so an arrow function, which we will be covering again towards the end of the video. Don't worry about it. It gives in the animal, which is basically the current iteration of the object. This is like saying the index, but since we're going over the animals, it will be the actual animal or whatever value is inside the array. And then I will simply console log it out. So console.log the animal, which is this one, and it logged out all the elements in the array. This is a very convenient loop. You will see it used all over the place. And there is another one which is quite similar, but it's used for creating new arrays. Animals.map will go over all the animals just like it did before with all the similar syntax. The animal will say that this is the current iteration that we're going to, and it will return. I will put here a new plus animal just to change these, that we see that these are new, and I will store it in an array, because by returning it, it's creating a new array and it's adding that current element to the array. So by saying const mapped array, which is basically storing the array, I can console log out the mapped array, and as you can see, it created a completely new array with the value that I've given there, which is now modified with the new keyword. So new lion, new bear, new whatever, that's it. And the third special one, that's basically again a loop, is called filter, which is animals.filter is how we are going to use it. It will yet again receive the same syntax, and it will return, and here comes a condition. It will return all the animals that has a length of at least 4, which will be 2 animals, just to spoiler this out. And it again creates a new array that have, then the new array will contain any animals or elements that will meet the condition that's given there. So const filtered array will be equal to the animals.filter. And then I simply console log this out, and you can see the length of those is greater than 4 because they are 5, the tiger and the shark. So it took all the other ones and just simply ignored them. It didn't get into the array, but those that met the condition, you could also say, for example, includes O, and then it will have an O in its name. So all those things you can put in conditions there, and if something meets the condition, it will get into the array. And now I will comment this out yet again, because we are moving on to conditionals, which are basically the if-else statements. Alright, so the way we are going to go about going through the if statements or the conditionals is by first of all creating a const called condition number. And this condition number, I will put it equal to 10. And an if statement basically receives a condition. So if condition number equals 10, and here you have to use the double equals, I've already used this before, then you do something. For example, console.log, and it's important to know that even if I put strings in here, it will, I already saved it, so it will run, because this doesn't check against the type of whatever's happening here. But if I put triple equals, which won't execute because it checks if the condition is actually a number, so the type is the same as you put in there. But if I was to wrap it like this in quotes, it would execute. But again, so it's usually a good way to use the triple equal signs. I will put this back from the quotation marks, and then this will execute. So basically an if is you give a condition, and then whatever is inside the body, inside the brackets, is executed. Then else if is what's going to happen if the first condition is not met. Then you check, for example, if condition number is less than 10, then we simply console log out less than 10. So if I say 9 here, then it will say less than 10. I could also chain this up by saying, let me just make some more space, as if condition number is greater than 10 and it's, so again, condition number, you give with the and a second condition is less than 15, then I console log out more than 10, less than 15. So if I say 11 in here, it will say more than 10, less than 15. And if any of these fails, so if the first condition fails, or the second condition fails, or I could change a third, a fourth, whatever condition fails, using an AND statement, the whole statement will be false. Now the opposite of an else statement is by saying else if to write another condition, condition number equal to 16, or condition number equal to 18. So if it's equal to either of these, then simply say or triggered. If any of these are true, either this or either the 18, it will get triggered. It does not matter if one of them is false, it will get triggered. For example, if I say 16, then it will say or triggered. Just to recap here, if is the basic statement, this is what you start with. Then there are else if statements, which can be chained to the if statement. And here you always give a condition inside. And the conditions can also be chained together with either an and or an or. And to wrap it up, there is also simply the else part of the whole if-else statement, which will trigger if none of these are true. Then, for example, console.log else this happens. So if it's, for example, 20, then it's not meeting any of the conditions, then it will say else this happens. It's a very primitive way to show you around in the if-else statements. You won't be using it this way, probably, but it's a good way to start. And here I've already talked about this. Let's create a let type checking variable, which will be equal to 10, and if type checking equal 10, so it's triple equals with the string 10, then console log it out, but it won't be logged out only if I remove the strings, because it's looking against the actual value, or sorry, the actual type. The brother of the if-else statement, which I rarely ever use, I believe it's a bit primitive, but it can be convenient in some ways. I will create a new variable called switch name, which will be equal to John. And it's the switch case statement that is the brother of the if statement. You will say switch, then parentheses, and you give in a value that you want to check against. The reason it's more primitive is because there is no condition that, or actually there is a condition, but it's, you'll see. So basically there is this switch name, and then you give a case. This is the condition where you give it. If it's equal to John. So that's basically it. If something is, so the switch name that you've given here, or the value that you've given here, is equal to John, then you do something. For example, console.log my name is John, and then you have to put break in here, and it's just more of a mess in a way that you have to do break and then all the other stuff. I just personally don't like it. You can use it. We could also make another case statement here. So if the condition means that the switch name is Adam, then it will log my name is Adam. So if I change it, then you will see that it writes Adam. And the default, there is something called a default here. After all of this, there is default. Then you specify what to do if none of these are given. For example, if I leave it empty, then it will say no name given. Pay attention to the syntax. There is parentheses here, then brackets, then this double points. I forgot the name in English. This is the switch case statement. A more advanced one that you will see very often used is something called the ternary operator. So I will create a bool here called ter bool, which will be equal to false, and let ternary operator, if you give a condition here, if the ter bool, and I mistyped it, F2 to rename it, ter bool, just like that, and it will rename it in all places. If the ter bool is, then the syntax comes like this. If it is true, so the condition, then question mark, then something will be returned. For example, blue will be returned. Else, so this is like the default in the switch case, or the simply else, then another value will be returned. So this is a binary return of value. There is no third way or third value to give back. What this is saying is that the ternary operator will be equal to either blue or green. If the ter bool is true, then it will be blue. If the ter bool is not true, then it will be green. So if I just console log out the value, the ternary operator, then you can see it's green, because right now it's false. But if I give a true in there, it will be true. So it just simply the value can either be this or this. That's what the ternary operator is used for. And this way you don't have to write an if statement, a primitive if statement, and it's much cleaner in the code. That's why developers prefer to use this over writing a new if statement. And now I just comment these all out, and we'll move on to functions. So functions are used to separate code, and functions are used to execute code in a way. And you already seen it happen back when we were using the for eaches, but the basic syntax for a function is saying function, then you give it a name. So for example, basic function, and throughout the video we are using camel case here, so the first letter or the first word is with small, and then each start of a word is big, and the basic function, and then you put brackets in here. Occasionally the functions can receive parameters. So for example, parameter 1 and parameter 2. These are values that are passed down to the function, and the function can do something with these values. For example, return, and the return is something that will end the function. So it can either return like this and the function ends, or you can say return and it will throw back a value that can be stored in a variable, just like we've seen it before. Return value plus parameter, and as you can see, calling a function, and if I now create a new variable, basic function return value, a long variable name, then I can call the basic function, which will be basically by calling its name, then parentheses, and it will receive parameters. So if I just do it like this, and then console.log the basic return value, it will get the return value undefined, because I haven't passed down an actual parameter in here. So I could pass down 11, for example, and then return value 11 will get printed, or 12. And you can see that since we're not using the second parameter, in JavaScript it won't throw errors, and it's not even necessary to pass down a second parameter, but I can if I want to. So that's the basic syntax of the JavaScript functions. You function, give it a name, then parentheses, then the optional parameters, if there are any parameters, you can give them, then the body of the function which will execute code. So not only can it return, but we can actually console log inside it or alert inside it. Actually, let's just alert this time. Alert function executed, and all throughout this video we are simply alerting and console logging, but don't worry about that, because we'll be moving on to DOM manipulation after the function settings, and that will be much better way to demonstrate things, because then we will be giving elements out, removing elements dynamically, coloring and adding CSS properties dynamically. So that's just a basic function. And there is something called an arrow function, which will be created by saying const arrow function, which will be equal to a parenthesis. Then you say an arrow, and then you open the body of the function. And then inside the body of the function, you can do all the things in JavaScript that you could, and you can also return. So it's basically just a function which will, I will say, return arrow, and the parameters will go in here. If you ever want to give some, then parameter one in here, and you can give an infinite amount of parameters basically. Then return arrow and plus parameter one, for example. This is what it's going to give back, this arrow function, and the calling of this function is similar to the actual simple function. So I just console.log, and since it's returning a value, I won't store it in a return value or a return variable. I will just simply say arrow function and call it, and then give, for example, 34 in there. It will say return arrow 34. I could also do it this way by storing the value first and then console logging it out. But with functions, this is also available because they are basically giving back a value and you can console log it out. And to make something that has more of a meaning in terms of functions, let's just create a sum function which will receive a and b as parameters. It will console.log out the a and b values, and it will return a plus b. So I console.log this sum, and I'm giving in a string version 1 plus 2. Well, how is it that, sorry, not like this, just like this. How is it that 1 plus 2 is equal to 12? Something isn't right. That's because JavaScript is not strictly typed, and what I have to do here is either remove the quotation marks and then it will be 3, or I can come in here and there is a function called parseInt, and integer is basically a number, so it will turn it into a number. It's a type of a number, and if you put it like this, parseInt a and parseInt b, then it will always return 3, because it from a string it turns it down to a number, and then the addition is simple as pie for JavaScript. And this will also work if I simply put in it in a normal human way, but you know how users are. And now I will comment these out, and we'll move on to DOM selection and manipulation, which will be the juicy stuff of JavaScript. Now to move on with DOM manipulation, first of all, I'll show you how to select an element and actually access its properties. So the way you do it is by saying document.get element by ID, and then the ID that you've given. For me, I have an age1 called myage1. If you have a look at the index.html, I've already given the ID there. You can create this whole thing right here, or you could just copy it over from the source code, whatever you prefer. And then this will actually return the element, and I can store it in a variable. So age1 ID select. And there is another way, which is basically const. It will again store it in a variable, age1 query select, and it's also with the document object. There is a method called query selector, and here you can either do it with the dot and give it a class, or a hashtag and give it an ID. But what I will do here is, if you press Ctrl plus space in VS Code for me, then you can choose an element type, and it will grab the first age1 that it bumps into. And then I will console log out these values, and I will refresh because for some reason, there we go. For some reason, live server sometimes messes these up. This is what you should be getting. It will give back its, well, basically the inner HTML would be the same if we logged it out. The age1, its ID, whatever's inside it, and this is the element that it grabbed with the ID select or the query select. Most people prefer to use the query selector because it's simpler and more straightforward, but if you are from an older coding generation, you are probably familiar with, where did I put that? You're probably familiar with getElementById. And now that we've selected by ID, we could also select, and not only by ID, but by element type, we could also select with classes. So const items classes select will be equal to the document dot get elements. So this is multi-type get elements by class name. This will return multiple elements, and here I'd like to receive the item class, and I will console log it out. Items class select will give me back an HTML collection which will contain multiple divs with the class item, because if you have a look here, there are 3 divs with the class item. So it's giving back us, it's similar to an array, an HTML collection. So just don't worry about it. Use it as an array because those functions work on it. And you can also loop through it if you want to. You could also do, let's create a new one, const items query select is what I'll call it, will be equal to document dot query selector all. So remember, we are selecting all the elements, and then inside the quotation marks dot item, and I will console log this out. You can see that this one gives back a node list, and there is not much difference between them. One of them is just a node list, one of them is an HTML collection. You can basically do the same. There is maybe a slight difference, but not that much. You can simply look at them as arrays, and it gives back the elements just as the get elements by class name did, but again, query selector is much more convenient. And I can also manipulate the actual text or the whole inner HTML that is inside an h1. For example, h1 id select, or we could get the h1 query select basically dot inner HTML, which will the whole HTML. If I log it out first, so just console.log, this is the whole HTML code that I can modify. It will be JavaScript crash course. So inside it, the text, I will remove this. I will set it to manipulating DOM, just like this. And you can see that the top h1 element changed to manipulating DOM. So we're already manipulating DOM elements here. One other thing that I could do is, well, let's use the h1 query select this time, but it will be the same element. h1 query select dot class list. This will enable us to add or remove classes from the class list. Dot add, which will add the class list, and there is a class called crimson that will simply change its color to crimson. I will simply say add the crimson class here, and you can see it's already red. One other thing I could do is h1 query select dot style dot, and here you can see all the styling options that you could do. For example, I could change the color to be, well, is aqua working? Yes, it is, because it's an embedded HTML color. Then you can also do this. I just prefer the crimson to be the last one executed. You could also set the style to aqua, but as you can see, since we are also adding the crimson, it does not matter because the aqua is an inline styling and it will overwrite everything. That it doesn't matter if you add the crimson class to it. So I will just clear this out, and we could also remove the crimson class by, let's say, just to use some variety, it's h1 id select because it's the same element dot class list dot remove, and then we're removing the crimson class from here, and now it's back to black. Now there is a way to add new elements to your HTML, which is simply by saying document dot create element, and then you specify what type of element you'd like to add. And here I'd like to add the new h1 element. But that's not enough. It won't put it into the actual DOM flow because you need to, first of all, store it in a variable, or at least, just to be clear, store it in a variable with a name created element, and then also created element dot inner HTML because it's basically empty. I'd like to say I am manually created, and not just that, but I'd like to say the document dot query selector, and I'm selecting the body here dot append child. This will put it to the end of the actual children of the elements, and since the body is holding everything together, I can just append the created element. There we go, it will append the I am manually created age1 to the body tag. That's super great. Now, and we could also remove one of the elements, for example, and this time I just showed you the document.querySelect.body, but you can actually access the document.body here simply dot remove child, and we are removing, what are we removing exactly? Well, let's remove the document.querySelector, and we're looking for the h2, which is the wolfed encode. So it will remove the wolfed encode from the body. And there you can see it's already removed. So now that we are through with the DOM manipulation, adding and removing elements, changing the stylings, changing the inner HTML and all that stuff, it's super great. Now we can move on to some event handling, for which I will copy over some forms. So in our index.html, just open it up. This will be in the source code, so do not fear. There is a button here, and I will remove this because I will be explaining it separately. So now that we have this button in this form, we can go back to our script.js, and to handle, for example, a click event, we can create a function called handle click. Now this handle click event, we receive something, a parameter, this is built into JavaScript and HTML, called event. Now this event parameter, I will first of all console log that I got clicked, and the event parameter will let you get some information of the actual button that was clicked, and I will also console.log out the event. No matter what, if we still click the button, it won't work. However, if I come here to the button and access an event called onClick, it will help me out, and I can put here the handle click event, and this will only work if the script is here, it's attached, and I will put in here this is a built-in element, the event will be received, and this way whenever I click the button now, it will execute whatever is inside the handle click function. So I can click it and it will say I got clicked, and it will throw back this type of event is a pointer event, and there are a bunch of values here that you can have a look at and access. You can also see the XY values, tilt. There is a target. This is an important one because the target will give back the button. So whatever you clicked in the event or whatever happened in the event, you will be able to access it with the event.target. But now let's just go back to the console. And this is how you handle events. You could also put an alert in there, some other styling changes whenever you click a button. The other way to do it is by saying age1 id select. So this way I'm not giving an onClick event to an element, but I'm from directly from JavaScript attaching a click event here dot add event listener, and here you can choose of all the events that are available in JavaScript, and I would say I want the click event, and then this will receive, after the comma, it will receive an arrow function that will yet again receive the event value, which I will this time just call e, and whatever's inside this arrow function will get executed. For example, age1 id select dot inner HTML will be equal to the I was clicked, and not only that, but I want the class list dot add. I want to add the crimson class whenever it's clicked, and I will just remove this. So whenever the age1 is clicked, we are changing its inner HTML, adding a new class, and this will work because we've added it directly from JavaScript. If I click it now, there we go, it changed, I was clicked. This is another way of handling events. So right now you already knew two ways to handle these events. As you can see, there is an onClick event here in the index.html as well, so if you prefer that way, you can do that. But the event listener adding and removing is way easier because you can also say age1 id select dot remove event listener, remove event listener, and then the click event, and then you would actually have to store this in a variable and then simply insert it here after the comma to remove it. But that's just the more advanced manipulation stuff. There are a lot of layers of JavaScript that you will learn throughout the usage of it. This is just the basic crash course that will get you started up on your feet, and you will be able to learn every nitty-gritty piece of it. Now let's create another function. This is the last function that we'll be writing. It will be called handle submit. And this handle submit function will receive the event value, and we're not going to do anything in it yet. Or maybe we will console log out that the form was submitted. And if you come to the form, there is an event directly on the form called onSubmit, and we will call this handle submit function right here, and it will receive the event value. As you can see, there is an input type text and the submit type, which will be enabling us to submit the actual element, or sorry, the form. And if I click it now, the submit, form was submitted, valid got logged for about half a second, and then the whole site reloaded. That's because there is a default behavior that we need to prevent. Otherwise, it would always be submitting a file and it would always be refreshing the page, which is not good, even from a bandwidth perspective if you're deploying a site. So event.prevent default is what we'll be using, and simply call this, and not event because I named it e.prevent default. And if I click it now, you can see that it will constantly log it whenever I click it, and it won't reload the page. And what we can also do is that there is the actual input element there, the text input. So console.log document.query selector, and we are selecting, look here, the input, but not just the input. This is how you select it in CSS. It will be input which has the type text, and it will bump into the first one, and there is only one on the site, so it's convenient for us. And dot value. So whatever I type into it, it will log it out. 1, 2, 3. It gets logged. Then ASD, it gets logged. There we go. This is a way you can access input elements. I could also just say input here, and since it's the first one, the text is the first one, it would get selected properly, but you can also select with a type right here. And this is the basic form handling. You could also put if statements in here to check if the value of the value is empty, then you wouldn't let it run, but there are also built-in attributes for that, for example the min value or the max value here in HTML. So yeah, that's basically it for our JavaScript crash course. I hope you enjoyed it. We went through the basic syntax, some basic event handling, DOM manipulation, all the console logs, the types, arrays and objects, all that's needed to get you up and running. If you found value in this video and would like to see more, please consider giving us a like, maybe even subscribe. And other than that, I hope to see you in the next one. Happy coding and God bless.